Welcome back, everyone. We're diving deep into the world of research, specifically how we know what we know or think we know. That's right, it's all about research methodology. And today we're tackling two key concepts that are like the gatekeepers of good science and, frankly, good thinking in general: reliability and validity. But don't worry, we'll keep things lively, I promise. So, to kick things off, let's just lay down the basics. Reliability. Well, it's all about consistency. Think of a scale that gives you a different weight every time you step on it. Not super reliable.
Definitely not the scale you want to use.
Exactly. Now, validity, on the other hand, it's about making sure the test actually measures what it's supposed to measure. Like, you could use a ruler to measure, I don't know, how much you like pizza.
I'm not sure that would work very well.
Right. It wouldn't be valid.
Hmm.
A ruler measures length, not pizza preference. And these two concepts, they're foundational, not just for scientific research, but honestly for how we evaluate information every day. So let's start with reliability. If a study's findings are like really groundbreaking, other researchers should be able to replicate those results. It's got to be repeatable, right?
Absolutely. If we can't replicate results, it really raises questions about the original findings.
It's like a recipe. You follow the steps, you should get the same kick every single time. Now, when it comes to actually estimating reliability, what are some of the ways researchers do that?
Okay, so there are a couple of broad categories we can think about here: external consistency and internal consistency.
Okay, so external consistency, I'm guessing that has something to do with like comparing results across different data collections.
You got it. It's about comparing findings from like two totally independent instances of gathering data.
And what are some of the methods used for that?
Well, one that's used a lot is test-retest reliability. You basically give the same test to the same group of people twice, with some time in between. If the scores from those two testing sessions are very similar, that's a good indicator of reliability.
Makes sense, but isn't there like a risk of people remembering the answers from the first test? Especially if the time gap isn't that long.
Oh yeah, for sure. That's actually a thing. We call that the memory effect.
Yeah.
And it can definitely inflate reliability estimates, making it seem like a test is more reliable than it actually is.
So like if you're testing memory itself and the time between tests is too short, people might remember those nonsense syllables or whatever you're using.
Exactly. And then there's the practice effect, too. People just get better at tests the more they take them. So even if they don't remember specific answers, they might just be more familiar with the format and the types of questions.
Right. Just like anything else, practice makes perfect, even with tests. And I guess there's always the issue of people dropping out between the first and second test, right?
Yeah, that can be a problem, too. If a lot of people miss the second test, it can skew the results and make it harder to get a reliable estimate.
So retest reliability, it's a good starting point, but it definitely has its limitations. What about that other one you mentioned, parallel forms reliability?
Yes. With parallel forms reliability, you use two different versions of the same test that are designed to measure the same thing, but with different questions.
So kind of like two different routes to the same destination.
Exactly. But it's not as common as you might think, because creating two truly equivalent forms, that's a challenge. It's like writing two different books that convey the same message.
Yeah, I can imagine that being a real headache for researchers. All right, so we've talked about external consistency. What about internal consistency? Is that more about how well different parts of a single test agree with each other?
Exactly. We're looking at whether different items on the test are all measuring the same underlying concept.
So, like, if we're testing for anxiety, we want to make sure all the questions on the test are actually getting at anxiety and not something totally different.
Precisely. And one way to do that is with something called split half reliability. Basically, you just split the test in half and compare the scores on each half.
So each half is like a mini version of the whole test.
Exactly. And if those two halves are measuring the same thing, the scores should be pretty darn similar.
And I guess you could split a test in tons of different ways, right?
Oh, yeah, you can. But there's this handy formula, the Spearman-Brown formula, that lets you adjust the correlation to account for the fact that shorter tests tend to be less reliable.
So it's like a way of making the reliability estimate more accurate, even if you're only looking at half the test.
Precisely. It helps us get a better sense of the test's overall reliability, even if we're just looking at a little piece of it.
Makes sense. Now, are there any other methods researchers use for internal consistency?
Yeah, a couple more. For a test where the answers are just right or wrong, like a multiple choice test, there's the Cooter-Richardson Formula 20, or KR20. Catchy name, right?
Sure, we'll go with catchy.
And then for tests that use scales, those strongly agree to strongly disagree kind of things, there's Cronbach's alpha.
Cronbach's alpha sounds important. What does that tell us?
It's basically a way of measuring how well different items on a test are measuring the same underlying concept. It's like taking the average of all possible split-half reliability, so it gives us a good overall sense of how internally consistent the test is.
Okay, so lots of different tools in the reliability toolbox. But I guess the main takeaway here is that different methods might give you slightly different reliability values, and some methods might be more appropriate than others depending on the test you're dealing with.
Exactly. And it's also worth noting that some types of reliability, like test-retest reliability or inter-rater reliability, which is where you have different people making judgments, tend to have lower reliability values just because time and individual differences, they play a role.
Yeah, human judgment always got to factor that in. So we've tackled reliability. Now on to the main event, validity. We've talked about how reliability is all about consistency, but validity, it's a whole different beast.
It really is. Like, are we actually measuring what we think we're measuring?
Yeah.
That's the heart of it.
Right. It's like a bathroom scale is a valid measure of weight, but not so much for, happiness.
Exactly. And there are several types of validity, each looking at it from a different angle.
All right, well, let's hear about them. What's the first one?
Let's start with content validity. It's all about making sure the items on a test, the questions or tasks, actually represent the whole scope of what you're trying to measure.
So, like, a driving test should cover all the essential driving skills, not just parallel parking.
Exactly. You want to make sure you're not just capturing one narrow slice of it, but the whole pie, so to speak.
Pie analogy, I like it. What's next?
All right, so then there's criterion-related validity. This is how well the test predicts performance on something external, something outside the test itself.
So, like, do those college entrance exams actually predict how well students will do in college, that kind of thing?
Exactly. There are actually two subtypes here, concurrent validity and predictive validity.
Okay, what's the difference?
Well, concurrent validity is when the criterion, that external thing you're measuring, is measured at the same time as the test.
So if I develop a new anxiety questionnaire, I could compare it to an existing well-established anxiety measure and see how they match up, right?
Exactly. That would be concurrent validity in action.
Got it. And predictive validity, I'm guessing that's about predicting something in the future.
You're on a roll. So our entrance example, that's predictive validity. Does it actually predict how well those students will perform in college down the line?
It's like trying to predict the future. All right, what's next on the validity hit list?
The big one, the one that often gets called the gold standard, construct validity.
Construct validity sounds intimidating. Break it down for us.
It's really about making sure that your measure is truly capturing the underlying concept, the construct that you're interested in. Not something else, not something that just looks similar.
So, like, if I'm trying to measure creativity, I want to make sure my test isn't actually measuring intelligence or artistic talent.
Exactly. Construct validity is a bit more complex. You often need multiple studies, different methods to really establish it.
Gotcha. So what are some of the tools in the construct validity toolbox?
Well, one important aspect is convergent validity. Basically, your measure should correlate with other measures of the same construct.
So my new creativity test should show a strong relationship with other established creativity tests.
Exactly. It's like getting confirmation from multiple sources.
Confirmation is always good. What else?
And then there's discriminant validity. This was kind of the opposite. Your measure should not correlate with measures of unrelated constructs.
So my creativity test shouldn't be too strongly related to, say, an intelligence test. That would suggest it's not really measuring creativity as a separate thing.
Exactly. It's all about making sure your signal isn't getting mixed up with other irrelevant signals.
So you're trying to isolate that pure creativity signal. It's like tuning a radio to find just the right station.
That's a great way to think about it. And all these different types of validity content, criterion-related, construct, they all work together to give us a more complete picture of how well our measurement tool is actually working.
So it's like a three-legged stool. We need all three legs to be strong if we want our measurements to be truly meaningful.
I like that analogy. And it reminds me, we also need to talk about internal and external validity. These are about the study design itself, not just the specific measurement tools.
Yeah, I was just thinking that they seem to be more about the big picture, right?
Right. Internal validity, it's all about being sure that the study design allows us to say confidently that it was the independent variable, the thing we manipulated, that caused the changes we saw in the dependent variable, the thing we measured.
Okay, so we want to be sure we're not mistaking correlation for causation. Like, just because two things are related doesn't mean one caused the other.
Exactly. And there are a lot of things that can threaten internal validity, like confounding variables, These are variables that are related to both the independent and dependent variables, making it hard to know which one is really driving the effect.
So, like, if we're studying the effect of a new medication on blood pressure, and we find that people who take the medication have lower blood pressure, we can't just assume it's the medication doing the work, right?
Right. Maybe those people are also more likely to exercise or eat healthier or have less stress. Those things could all affect blood pressure too.
So, how do researchers try to control for all those other factors, those potential confounding variables?
Well, one of the most important strategies is random assignment. That's where you randomly assign participants to different groups in the study to try to even out any pre-existing differences between those groups.
So, it's like shuffling a deck of cards. You're trying to make sure each group is as similar as possible at the start.
Exactly. That way, if you see a difference between the groups later on, you can be more confident it's because of the thing you manipulated, not some other hidden variable.
Random assignment, it's like the great equalizer of research. But I know there are other threats to internal validity too, right?
Oh yeah, there are a bunch.
Yeah.
Like history, that's a big one. It refers to events that happen outside the study that could affect the results.
So if we're doing a study on stress and a global pandemic hits during the study, well, that's going to have an impact, right?
Big time. That would be a history threat because it's an external event that could affect everyone in the study, regardless of what group they're in.
Wow, so researchers have to be like detectives, constantly on the lookout for these potential threats to their study.
It's true. And sometimes those threats are hard to predict or control for, but just being aware of them is a good first step.
Okay, so we've covered internal validity pretty thoroughly. What about external validity?
External validity, it's all about generalizability. Can we take the findings from our study and apply them to other people, other settings, other times?
So it's about how well our findings hold up in the real world outside the specific context of the study.
Precisely. And just like with internal validity, there are some sneaky threats lurking out there.
Like what?
Well, one common one is the interaction of selection and treatment. It basically means that the effect of the intervention might only work for the specific type of people who were in the study.
So if I do a study on a new teaching method, but I only include students who are already high achievers, those findings might not apply to students who struggle more.
That's a great example. The effects of the intervention might depend on certain characteristics of the people involved.
Gotcha. So it sounds like sample selection is super important for external validity.
It really is. We want our sample, the people in our study, to be as representative as possible of the larger population we're interested
A
in.
microcosm of the real world.
Exactly. And there's the setting to consider, too. A study done in a tightly controlled lab might not have the same results as one done in a more natural, messy, real-world setting.
And I guess historical context matters too, right? Findings from a study done 50 years ago might not hold true today because so much has changed about the world.
Totally. The social, cultural, technological landscape, it all plays a role.
So researchers have to be time travelers thinking about how their findings might hold up across different eras.
It's true. External validity, it's all about looking beyond the immediate context of the study and thinking about the bigger picture.
It sounds like achieving both high internal and high external validity, it's a real balancing act.
It can be. But it's an important one because we want our research to be both rigorous and relevant to the real world.
Absolutely. All right, so we've really dug deep into the nitty-gritty of reliability and validity. Now I want to shift gears a bit and talk about what happens when research falls short in these areas. What are the real-world implications? It's almost like those cautionary tales you hear about where a study gets a lot of attention, but then other researchers can't replicate the findings.
Oh yeah, those are classic examples of reliability issues cropping up. And they highlight why replication is so crucial in science.
It's that whole trust but verify thing, right?
Exactly. You don't want to base important decisions on findings that can't be independently verified.
And I imagine validity problems can be even trickier to spot sometimes, right? Especially if a study seems really well designed on the surface.
Absolutely.
Mm.
You can have a study that's super tightly controlled with perfect internal validity, but if the measures themselves aren't valid, the findings are basically meaningless.
It's like using a broken compass to navigate. You might be following the directions perfectly, but you're still going to end up lost.
That's a great analogy. And it highlights why it's so important to critically evaluate not just the study design, but also the measures being used.
All right, so let's get specific. What are some real-world examples of where reliability and validity really matter, like where the stakes are high?
Well, one area that immediately comes to mind is medical research. Think about drug development. Pharmaceutical companies invest millions even billions of dollars in clinical trials.
And those trials are all about testing whether a new drug is effective and safe, right?
Exactly. But if those trials are poorly designed, or if the measures they're using to assess the drug's effects aren't reliable and valid, well, that's a huge problem.
Because then you might end up with a drug that gets approved based on faulty evidence.
And that could give patients false hope, expose them to unnecessary risks. It's a really high-stakes situation.
It's like building a bridge without proper engineering. It might look okay, but it could collapse under pressure.
Exactly. And the implications go beyond medical treatments. Think about education. We rely heavily on standardized tests to assess student learning and teacher effectiveness.
Yeah, those tests get a lot of attention and often a lot of criticism.
And for good reason. There have been so many cases of standardized tests that are poorly designed or culturally biased or just plain unreliable.
And when those flawed tests are used to make high-stakes decisions about kids' futures or teachers' careers, well, that's a recipe for disaster.
It really is. Those decisions need to be based on solid, trustworthy data, which means the assessments have to be both reliable and valid.
So it's not just about the tests themselves, it's about the consequences of using those tests to make important decisions.
Absolutely. And this brings us to another really important area, public policy.
Governments are always using research to inform their policies, right? On everything from crime to healthcare to climate change.
Totally. But the same principles apply. If the research that's informing those policies is flawed, the policies themselves are likely to be flawed as well.
So garbage in, garbage out, as they say.
It's true. And the consequences can be huge, ineffective policies, waste taxpayer money, they can even cause harm.
It's like trying to solve a complex problem with a faulty calculator. You're bound to get the wrong answer.
And in the case of public policy, those wrong answers can affect millions of people.
Wow, this really puts things into perspective. Reliability and validity, they're not just academic concepts, they have real-world teeth.
I agree. And it highlights why it's so important for everyone, not just researchers, to have at least a basic understanding of these concepts.
So we can all be more informed consumers of information, more critical thinkers.
Exactly. We need to be asking those questions. Is this reliable? Is this valid?
Because those questions, they're not just about research, they're about how we make sense of the world around us.
It's about being curious, being skeptical, being willing to dig a little deeper.
Well, I think we've given our listeners a lot to chew on today. This deep dive into reliability and validity, it's been quite a journey.
It really has. And I hope it's empowered our listeners to be more critical, more discerning when encountering research findings, claims, data of all kinds.
Because in today's world, being able to evaluate information effectively, that's a superpower.
It really is. It's the key to making informed decisions, to navigating the complexities of the world around us.
So, to our listeners, keep asking those questions, keep that skeptical eye sharp, and keep exploring the world of knowledge with a critical mind. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and we'll catch you next time.
Thanks for watching. If you found this video helpful, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and share it with your friends. Your support helps us keep creating valuable content like this. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss an update. Join our community for more insights into psychology and personal development. Let's grow and learn together.